After America is made on the lands of the Kure Wurrung, Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, we acknowledge that they and their ancestors have cared for the lands, rivers and sea, and all living creatures for thousands of generations. We pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded.
We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
Hi, I'm Angus Blackman, and this is After America. Birds of a feather flock together. And over the weekend, they flocked to Alaska.
Any moment now, President Trump is set to speak at a news conference after he met face-to-face with Russian President Vladimir Putin.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. President. That was very profound.
Sooner or later, we had to amend the situation to move on from the confrontation to dialogue.
20,000 Russian soldiers were killed last month in July in this war. That just tells you the price they're willing to pay. Not saying any of this is admirable. I'm saying that this is the reality of the war that we're facing. It's become attrition in some ways. It's a meat grinder, and they just have more meat to grind.
There is no immediate ceasefire. There is no conditional ceasefire. There is no agreement, although Vladimir Putin hinted at agreement. I think Vladimir Putin has played a blinder and has fooled yet another US president.
The future of Ukraine was the subject of the latest Trump-Putin love-in. But Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky was not required. Again. With me to talk about the talks, Israel's war on Gaza and Trump's nationalisation of the Washington DC police is Dr. Emma Shortis, Director of the International and Security Affairs Program here at the Australia Institute. Hi, Emma.
Hi, Angus. How are you?
I'm not too bad. Feeling refreshed after a nice break. How are you?
Excellent. I'm good. Maybe not that refreshed. There's too much happening, but we can get into that.
Yeah. So Trump and Putin met in Alaska over the weekend. What happened?
Mm-hmm. They did. They met in Alaska after much scrambling to organise a head of state summit. In true Trump fashion, it was put together in under a week and unbelievably didn't have any particularly concrete outcomes. But yes, Trump met Putin there in Alaska. So insert Tina Fey does Sarah Palin meme here. Thanks, producer.
I believe that diplomacy should be the cornerstone of any foreign policy.
And I can see Russia from my house.
Trump literally rolled out the red carpet for the Russian authoritarian leader. And
that was nice of him.
Yeah, very, very kind. Even applauded him as he walked down the red carpet. They ended up having a relatively short meeting that was notable more for its lack of outcomes than for anything else. In the lead up, Trump was talking up the prospects of a ceasefire and of course, his ability to broker deals, but that is not what happened. I think there was great concern leading into this meeting that Trump would somehow agree to Russian demands for Ukrainian territory, that Ukraine would be somehow forced to concede its territory to Russia, more territory than Russia has actually seized through this illegal invasion. That doesn't appear to have happened in this instance, but of course we don't really know, like a lot of meetings between Trump and Putin, we don't actually know what has gone on. They've made some vague statements about, we agree on some things, we still disagree on some big things. We don't know what those are. Presumably one of them is ending the war. But really, I think what we've seen, what we've always seen, I think with Trump and Putin, where Putin knows how to play Trump. One of the things we do know that they talked about, because Trump himself talked about it, was how, Putin reinforced to Trump that he did win the 2020 election, that it was rigged because the United States has mail-in ballots and you can't possibly have a secure election with mail-in ballots. So, Putin knows how to play Trump. He knows how to flatter him, how to make him feel good and confirm all of his conspiracy theories. So I guess it's played out kind of as we would have expected. Trump talks about peace. There was a big banner at their 12-minute press conference with prospects for peace written across it.
Because if you put it on a banner behind you, that makes it real. That's how it works.
Yeah. generally works out well for US presidents involved in conflicts. But we know Trump doesn't really care about peace. He cares about trophies. He doesn't care about peace.
Yeah. President Putin also having a bit of experience getting around term limits, so maybe there was a bit of chat around that.
Oh, yeah, possibly.
Yeah. So this is not the first conversation between the United States and Russian governments over the conflict in Ukraine. Delegates of both governments met in Saudi Arabia earlier in the year. And of course, in Trump's first term, he and Putin had discussions as well. How does this one kind of compare to those previous meetings?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And I think until and unless we know more about this most recent meeting, it's difficult to say, because there was, of course, that, I don't know if iconic's the right word, but there was that meeting during the first Trump administration where the almost universal conclusion of American media in particular was that Trump humiliated himself in front of Putin. That was the one where they kind of, as I hope I'm recalling this correctly, they threw out the translators and had a secret meeting with no notes. And there was all kinds of speculation, of course, because that was during the Russiagate scandal, which Trump continues to bring up, I think, which, as we were saying earlier, really suits Putin's interests. I've seen some coverage, really quite strong coverage, I suppose, of this most recent meeting, describing it in one case as worse than Munich, as worse than Chamberlain's appeasement of Hitler, which is a kind of facetious historical comparison. But this is, I think, how seriously people are taking the consequences of this meeting, and Trump potentially at least agreeing to Russia taking this territory from Ukraine and a quote-unquote ceasefire or peace deal that would be unacceptable to Ukrainians and to Europe more broadly. So, I mean, that doesn't really answer your question about how the meetings compare, but they are consistent, at least in the way that Putin understands Trump, and in some ways in the kind of general escalation, I think, of Russian confidence, I think partly for two reasons. The first one being, and we've talked about this a bit, is the very clear ideological alignment between Putin's version of Russia and the kind of Trump Make America Great Again coalition generally, which I think often gets overshadowed by Trump-Putin strongman relationship, where there is an ideological admiration for Russia within the white Make America Great Again movement that sees Putin as a successful leader of effectively a white patriarchal ethno-state, a model that they are trying actively to implement at home in the United States. And that ideological alignment, I think, often gets underestimated. And that kind of leads me to the second reason, where what we're seeing with the Trump administration is a kind of imperial revival, a revival and a revitalization of the imperial presidency that is mirrored, I think, by the imperial ambitions of Putin's regime. And that was embodied in this really kind of outrageous outfit choice by the Russian foreign minister, which didn't get heaps of attention. But he was wearing a shirt that said USSR, like the Soviet Union. And yeah, it's outrageous. And Putin and, Lavrov have been really explicit in their ambitions really to revive not the Soviet Union itself, but the kind of territorial dominance of the Soviet Union. And for Lavrov to wear that at this meeting is pretty brazen and reflects that confidence in the imperial revival and the alignment, the general ideological alignment between the two regimes.
You're not in a good position. You don't have the cards right now.
Offer some words of appreciation for the United States of America and the president who's trying to save your country.
You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III. You're gambling with World War III. If you didn't have our military equipment, this war would have been over in 2 weeks.
In 3 days. I heard it from Putin. In 3 days.
So all of this surely puts Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in a pretty difficult spot. President Zelensky is due to meet President Trump on Monday US time and is reportedly going to be accompanied by leaders from Germany, France and Britain. Presumably that's some kind of effort on the part of the Europeans to show solidarity with Zelensky and ensure that, I guess, a repeat of that first horrific Oval Office ambush, doesn't occur.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's quite clearly an attempt to do that. I saw one report that described their leaders accompanying Zelensky as a dream team of European leaders, which made me want to scratch my eyes out. Anyway, so yeah, he has assembled this kind of coalition of European leaders that support Ukraine, including Starmer, the UK Prime Minister, Merz, the German Chancellor, Emmanuel Macron, the French President, also the Secretary General of NATO, of calling Trump daddy fame, and a few other people. So they'll all go to the White House in this kind of general show of solidarity. And of course, almost all of the coverage that you read about this is how are all of these leaders going to manage Trump? Does Macron take the lead because he's so good at, kind of using his French charm to romance Trump? Like, how do they make sure Trump doesn't feel like it's an ambush or that they're all telling him he's got this wrong and he has to change his mind, which is all pretty gross when you think about it. And it is partly because Zelensky and the Ukrainians are in such an awful position, where they cannot rely on Trump because he is inherently untrustworthy, and because of that ideological alignment with Russia that I was just talking about, because they know, that they can go into this meeting and Trump might be charmed by them. He might promise them all kinds of things, and then he'll talk to somebody else and change his mind completely, and post something on Truth Social, as he's been doing, about how the Ukrainians are going to have to make concessions. So it's a horrible mess. And of course, all of these leaders, as much as they want to charm Trump, can only go so far because of their own democratic principles and values, where Putin can say to Trump the election was stolen, can confirm all of those biases and conspiracy theories that we were just talking about, where European leaders can't and won't do that rightly. But that means their ability to convince Trump of anything is incredibly constrained. So, that's a long way of saying that it's a horrible mess that doesn't bode well for the Ukrainian leader or the Ukrainian people. And that's partly because of, what are some seemingly intractable problems at the moment, where Ukraine and the Ukrainian leadership rightly want some security guarantees. They want to promise that, if there is an end to the conflict, that Putin's Russia wouldn't, break the terms of the agreement.
Which it's done something like 15 times, I think I was reading in previous.
Yeah, there's every reason to think that Russia would break any terms. And that's why the Ukrainian leadership are seeking security guarantees from Europe and from the United States. So there have been suggestions for a long time, that Ukraine might get a quote unquote NATO-style security guarantee, where there's a promise that any aggression from Russia would be met by Europe and US in the style of Article 5, but Article 5, but not NATO, I suppose. And that presumably is going to be unacceptable to Putin. His argument for a long time has been about NATO membership and European expansionism as a justification for the illegal invasion. So, how a Trump administration might be able to get through some of those issues is at least not foreseeable at the moment. But, I guess if we want to take some heart, the coalition of European leaders that is going to Trump is quite a strong one, to have the French and German leader there at the same time presenting a united front is significant. Again, whether it has any effect on Trump remains to be seen.
Yeah. So I want to move now to Israel and Palestine. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu announced plans last week to occupy Gaza City. What's the latest in, I guess, that plan?
Yeah, sure. So this, Israel's war on Palestine has now been going for almost 2 years, about 22 months, and this is the latest in a series of escalations where the Netanyahu government has signed off on plans to essentially occupy Gaza City, which would mean displacing another 1 million Palestinian people on top of the close to 2 million people who have already been displaced by this war. This plan has been met with almost universal international condemnation, particularly from the United Nations, because of that forced displacement and because it would compound an already horrific humanitarian catastrophe in terms of Palestinian people's access to aid and shelter and basic infrastructure. So this is another very frightening development, and I think is adding to, this mounting, mostly so far only rhetorical, but mounting concern that we're seeing from leaders around the world and increasing push towards recognition of Palestinian statehood.
Yeah, I want to get to that recognition, particularly from Australia, in just a second. But you talked about the international response, but there's also been a response within Israel. There are strikes in Israel protesting these plans?
Yeah, that's right. There has been a really large protest in Israel, in Tel Aviv, that's followed a general strike. Reports of up to 500,000 people involved in this protest who are calling for an end to Israel's war on Gaza and the return of the remaining hostages, about 20 of whom are believed to be still alive. So this protest is responding to a general sense, correct one, I think, that Netanyahu is not particularly focused on bringing the hostages home, that's not his main priority, and that if it were his main priority, he would be behaving quite differently. The Israeli government would be behaving quite differently. So this protest was organised by what's called the Hostages and Missing Families Forum, based on that argument that the initial response to October 7 was justified, but that the war has gotten out of control and is no longer justified and is actually risking the lives of the remaining hostages.
Today I can confirm that at the 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly in September, Australia will recognise the state of Palestine.
To have European countries and Australia march into that rabbit hole is disappointing, and I think it's actually shameful.
I've said it publicly and I said it directly to Prime Minister Netanyahu. The situation in Gaza has gone beyond the world's worst fears.
The best way to ensure peace and stability in the Middle East is for there to be two states. And the reason for urgency behind recognition is this: there is a risk that there will be no Palestine left to recognise if the world does not act.
There's an enormous level of disappointment and some disgust. As Israel's closest partner, we would have expected that there would have been some heads up.
So last week, as we record, the Australian government announced that it would recognise Palestine at the next United Nations General Assembly meeting in September. What does this mean in kind of practical terms?
In practical terms, I think not heaps, to be honest. This is a symbolic recognition that will be made, as you said, Angus, at the UN General Assembly in September, and it will mean that Australia joins the 147 other members of the United Nations that already recognise a Palestinian state. But that doesn't mean that, this isn't important or significant that Australia is doing this. Symbolically, it is very important, and I think it's really direct evidence that protest and pressure works. The Australian government has done this, I think, in direct response to growing concern and growing protest in Australia, including of course, the really big protest across the march across the Harbour Bridge. So it's a recognition, I think, of that growing community concern and horror at what the Israeli government is doing in Gaza, and has been framed by the Australian government in its announcement as an important step towards a two-state solution and the eventual creation of a Palestinian state. And I think the importance of Australia doing this is reflected in the reaction by both the Israeli government and the Trump administration, which have been very strong in their condemnation of Australia recognising a Palestinian state, precisely because Australia does have important influence and credibility here. For even Australia, which has aligned itself so closely with the United States and kind of therefore Israel for so long, for even Australia to commit to recognising a Palestinian state is a pretty significant symbol, I suppose, of how much the ground has shifted.
In response to this decision by the government, the opposition has said it would revoke the recognition of a Palestinian state. And opposition leader Susan Ley said the announcement disrespects the United States. There's a bit going on there.
Mm.
If our relationship with the United States, which is supposed to be our strongest and most important international alliance, can't stand up to Australia making a decision in what it sees is its own kind of national interests, then what's the point of it?
That's a great question, I guess. I think, if you take the framing of the opposition leader, the point is that there is no distinction between the interests of the United States and the interests of Australia. Like that is what the opposition leader is saying, that our interests are the United States interests. Our interests are dictated by the United States interests because we rely entirely on the United States for its protection. And if we dare to embarrass Daddy, he's going to abandon us. So I guess, I mean, at least they're being honest about where their allegiances lie. But it's interesting to think about who they think they're talking to with those kinds of statements, because it's fairly clear, I think, from polling we've done at the Australia Institute, polling that has been done elsewhere, general community sentiment. We just talked about that protest across the Harbour Bridge. Who do they think they're talking to when they're, wringing their hands about offending Donald Trump over the recognition of Palestine, when we are talking about, what Amnesty International has repeatedly called a genocide unfolding in real time. The death toll in Palestine surpassed 60,000 people in June, and one study done by The Lancet estimates that the actual death toll could be 40% higher than that, partly as a result of uncounted direct deaths, but also indirect deaths as a result of, the collapse of infrastructure, as a result of starvation, disease, a lack of medical care, etc. For keeping someone like Donald Trump on side to be your priority and the thing you focus on in the face of that, I think is pretty astounding, and certainly the evidence suggests is so far away from where the community sits on this issue.
Yeah. And just before we move to a little bit of US domestic politics, a couple of weeks back, Australia's Foreign Minister Penny Wong said that there was a risk that there would be no Palestine left to recognise unless the world does more to implement a two-state solution. But, given the expansion of Israeli settlements over a long period of time and the catastrophic damage inflicted on Gaza, is a two-state solution a realistic possibility now?
I think the first thing I'd say in response to that is that the foreign minister is right. The possibility that there is no Palestine left to recognise is a very real one, and seems by all evidence to be the direct aim of the Netanyahu government, to make a two-state solution an impossibility by really destroying the means for the Palestinian Authority to build statehood. How do you do that when you have no infrastructure, when you're facing a humanitarian crisis of the scale that we're seeing? How do you build sovereignty from that basis? It's certainly possible, but I suppose what I'm saying is that the conditions for a two-state solution are not in place at the moment, and that is at least partly the direct result of the Israeli government's actions and intentions, where they are on a permanent war footing and seeking to deny the possibility of those conditions even existing for Palestine. And the other thing to say there is that as long as the administration in the United States has no interest in pursuing or building those conditions for a two-state solution to be possible, then again, at the moment at least, the conditions aren't in place. That's not to say that they can't be built, but that has to be the starting point, for having the conditions in place for genuine peace building. And I've written about this with colleagues, including Alan Beam, a colleague of ours who's often on the podcast, to argue that, the conditions for a two-state solution do not exist. And so it's a very real risk for the Australian government to get sucked into a paradigm that assumes the conditions are in place to create a two-state solution. And so what's really important for Australia is, to continue down the path of recognition and providing humanitarian aid, of adhering to and supporting the principles of international law, but at the same time, not getting, sucked into the assumptions that a two-state solution is possible at the moment. And we've actually made the argument that significant commitment and imagination is required, and that any path towards peace has to be built on those foundational principles, that we adhere to at home of democracy and of the rule of law. And as long as Israel and Palestine have a relationship that is, essentially one of apartheid, that is not based on equal rights, then pursuing a two-state solution within that framework is bound to fail. And that's where, other models that we have for building peace out of long-term, often existential conflict can or could be, potentially very helpful. So, we're talking about more collective international pathways towards genuine peace, such as that taken by the European Union in the aftermath of the Second World War, where, states like Germany and France had been at war with each other on and off for centuries, and eventually built peace together based on those foundational principles of human rights, democracy, equality under the rule of law. And again, at the moment, those conditions do not exist in Israel and Palestine, which is not to say, again, that they can't. They absolutely can, but that requires a recognition of the state of things now, and the state of things now is pretty terrible.
Yeah. We're running out of time, but I wanted to just touch on a little bit of US domestic politics and law. Recently, Trump nationalized the Washington, D.C. police force using incorrect crime, it's probably the generous term, crime data as a pretense. He'd said it was the worst ever or something, and it
of course.
Demonstrably wasn't. What impact is this having in D.C.?
I think this is one of those examples, Angus, of what we've talked about before, of how it's so difficult to understand Trump and the Trump phenomenon, because it is simultaneously ridiculous and really dangerous. So it is utterly ridiculous to have the National Guard patrolling in Washington, D.C. down the National Mall, which is like one of the quietest and calmest places potentially in the United States. Like, if you've ever been to DC, it's almost kind of un-American in that it's really walkable, like it has great public infrastructure. I had the last time I was in DC, I walked everywhere, and aside from the kind of horror of the election unfolding, sat out on the street and had an old-fashioned by myself and felt perfectly safe. So to have kind of guys in military fatigues and driving Humvees around, while people are kind of like taking their morning run down the National Mall is ridiculous. But it's also, to highlight the contradictions of the Trump phenomenon, really incredibly dangerous, because people are also simultaneously being disappeared off the streets of DC by masked law enforcement officers. Trump is in the White House talking about the Smithsonian Museum and how it needs to reflect his own kind of patriotic values, while the Smithsonian itself is surrounded by military Humvees. This is, like, it's almost not possible to get a clearer demonstration of dangerous authoritarianism than that. So it's hard to talk about because it's both incredibly silly and really scary.
And I mean, with the midterms coming up next year, decisions like this aren't super encouraging, I wouldn't have thought, for the prospects of, a free and fair election where everyone gets a vote.
No, not super encouraging. And it's really important, I think, that you bring up that context. On the last episode of the podcast, we talked about, that effort to redistrict states so that in the midterms, Republicans pick up more seats. And these moves, I think, have to be seen exactly in that context. And it's, I think, quite rightly, widely assumed that this federalization of DC that Trump is engaged in and his deployment of Marines to Los Angeles in response to peaceful protests there are test runs for the suppression of Democrat cities, as Trump likes to call them, in particular. And they've been pretty open about that. So, no, not super encouraging for the future of American democracy.
Yeah. I feel like it's been a really grim episode. I guess you
has.
can only play what's in front of you. Emma, thank you very much for joining me on your own show today.
That's my pleasure, as always. Thanks, Angus.
If you want to read more from the Australia Institute, you can order the second edition of our Vantage Point series, Dead Centre: How Political Pragmatism is Killing Us by Richard Dennis explores the contradiction between centrism and evidence that sits at the heart of democratic debate in Australia. You can buy Richard's essay for $19.95 or become a subscriber to the Vantage Point series via our website, australiainstitute.org.au/store, or tap the link in the show notes. This episode was recorded on Monday, the 18th of August, and After America is supported by the Andrew Farron Foundation. We'll be back next week. I'm Angus Blackman. Thanks for listening.